When President Lincoln attempted to resupply Fort Sumter in April of 1861, the South fired on the Union's resupply ships and the Civil War had begun. General-in-Chief Winfield Scott developed a strategy for Lincoln and the Union. He devised a strategy that would take a year to train soldiers and build a navy while setting up a blockade and using the Mississippi River to break the South into sections and basically choke the South economically. This plan became known as the Anaconda Plan. The plan called for the Navy to blockade southern ports and use the Mississippi River to begin putting a stranglehold on the Confederacy. In addition, the Union Army would target the Confederate capital city of Richmond. However, this plan was considered too slow as most in the North were eager to begin fighting and win right away. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to serve 3-month enlistments to suppress the open rebellion. Both sides believed that the war would be very short. Even though the Anaconda Plan wasn't officially adopted, the way the Union would defeat the Confederates would be by blockading the coast, securing the Mississippi River, and taking Richmond. The Southern strategy would be known as King Cotton diplomacy. The South knew that the textile industry was the major industry in Europe and believed that the world needed Southern cotton so bad that European nations would surely recognize the Confederacy and establish trade and support. The South focused on getting help from Britain and France. In terms of fighting the war, the South had an advantage by having to wage a defensive war and was willing to give up space for time, a goal of prolonging the war. The South also aimed to break the Union blockade and developed blockade runners. They needed to protect their coastline and gain control of ports, especially if they aimed to trade with European nations. Capturing Washington, D.C. was also a Confederate goal. After the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter and the Civil War had broken out, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the open rebellion in the South. More than 75,000 volunteered, and both sides had soldiers who were eager to fight and eager to win. Americans hadn't fought in a war since the Mexican War and were very excited about the opportunity to serve their cause. The volunteers gathered around Washington, D.C. in various camps. This war was destined to be an adventure, and excitement ran high on both sides. The First Battle of Bull Run would be the first major battle of the Civil War. In July of 1861, General Irvin McDowell was in charge of defending Washington, D.C., while General William Patterson was 60 miles northwest of the capital near the Shenandoah Valley. For the Confederacy, General Joseph E. Johnston was in the Shenandoah Valley, while the largest Confederate army under General P.G.T. Beauregard was poised to march on Washington, D.C. In July of 1861, Irvin McDowell and the Union moved westward to confront Beauregard and the Confederates. Beauregard moved into a position to protect Manassas Junction, an important railroad city. The Confederates were concentrated around Bull Run Creek. As the Union soldiers began to engage the Confederates in the first major battle of the war, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston slipped out of the Shenandoah Valley away from General Patterson and marched to the railroad town to be transported to Manassas Junction for the battle. Irvin McDowell and the Union advanced towards Bull Run. Confederates moved to stop the Union advance and engaged in fierce fighting. Both sides brought more troops onto the field, but the Union was able to bring in more cannons and more infantry, which forced the Confederates to fall back to a position called Henry Hill. The Confederates were hoping to hold Henry Hill, where a key fighting would take place. The Henry House was a farmhouse on the Henry property. As the disorganized Confederates set up a position on Henry Hill, reinforcements came led by General Thomas Jackson out of Joseph Johnston's army that came from the Shenandoah Valley. After a delay, the Union begins to take position around the Henry House on Henry Hill. The Confederates, eager to fight, begin to attack and charge the Union soldiers. They do get pushed back. As the Confederates were being pushed back, General Barnard Bee came to see General Thomas Jackson for aid. Jackson told Bee to give the enemy the bayonet. Bee saw that Jackson's men were holding their ground and looked to rally his own men by pointing to Jackson and the Virginians. This rally worked, and the Confederates were able to regain the field and hold their ground.
Rally, men, rally! like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here today, and we will conquer. Rally behind the Virginians!
The Union would launch several bloody assaults, only to be weakened as the day went on. The Confederates were able to bring in reinforcements and even extended their line beyond the Union flank. The Confederates not only drove the Union soldiers from the field, but the Union soldiers were now running towards Washington, D.C. This victory for the Confederates became a rout, and the Confederates won the first major battle of the Civil War. This Confederate victory was significant because it ended the Union idea that the war was going to be a short war won by a volunteer army. The public in the North was shocked at an unexpected defeat that was widely predicted to be a victory. President Lincoln authorized the enlistment of another 500,000 men for up to 3 years of service. The South was excited for the victory, but also realized greater battles and greater losses lied ahead. After first Bull Run, both armies looked to increase in size and knowledge of tactics. The armies trained as they prepared for a longer war than originally anticipated. Confederate soldiers were typically called Johnny Reb, while Billy Yank was the nickname given to Union soldiers. Drilling was part of the daily routine for the soldiers in order to improve their battle skills. Both Union and Confederate armies were without luxuries during the war. Whether a regiment was well or badly trained, disciplined, and cared for depended largely on its officers and to some extent on the initiative and enterprise of the men themselves. Regiments camped where they could, foraged for fuel and often for food, and depended on their own resources or on others around them. The Civil War armies were youthful, high-spirited, sentimental, and for the most part moral. Leisure activities in a camp included playing dominoes or cards, as well as singing songs or writing letters home. It wasn't uncommon for Union and Confederate soldiers to call a truce in order to trade various goods. There were three basic units of the Civil War armies. The infantry would be the soldiers on foot who marched into battle and fought. They formed long lines and conducted charges with the bayonet, which is what was learned from previous wars as well as what was taught to officers at West Point. However, the Civil War saw improved rifle bullets that proved this method of waging war to be more deadly. The cavalry would be the soldiers on horseback, mostly used for scouting as well as being in front of the infantry in order to be the eyes of the army when the army was on the move. The artillery consisted of the big guns and cannons. Light or field artillery was movable, whereas the heavy artillery was in one place and was used to defend fortified positions. The Napoleon cannon was the most commonly used cannon in the Civil War. An artillery battery consisted of 4 to 6 cannons with 8 men per cannon and 4 to 6 horses to pull each cannon into battle. A limber is what was used to pull each cannon. The caissons were lined up behind the cannons and limbers up to a mile with most of the ordnance. The 8 men in each cannon included 1 to give orders, 1 to load, 1 to use the cannon rod, 1 to fire the cannon, 2 at the limber, and 2 to carry ordnance. Common ordnance used included the shot, which was a round solid cannonball used to knock down charging soldiers or fortified positions. It was used at long range. Shorter range ordnance was canister, which shot out hundreds of bullets or pieces of metal, and it was used on charging soldiers at closer range. The soldiers of the Civil War had to deal with terrible medical conditions. Doctors at the time didn't know about things like blood type or sterilization. Doctors didn't know about infections. They didn't even bother to wash their hands. Many soldiers died from infections and disease. Even a small wound could get infected and cause a soldier to die. The idea of medicine during this time was very primitive. They had little knowledge of painkillers or anesthetics. They did have some anesthetics, but largely whiskey was used. During major battles, there were far more wounded soldiers than doctors. There was little doctors could do for wounds to the torso, but the wounds to the arms and legs, they often amputated. Overall, the worst enemy of the soldiers was invisible, that of disease. More men died of disease than in battle. Proper sanitation and sterilization were unknown at the time, and disease would set in more easily due to infections that set in. Amputation was the major way to deal with a bullet wound to the arms and legs. Wounds in battle increased from previous wars due to the improved technology. Clara Barton served as a nurse during the Civil War. She was often called Angel of the Battlefield. She is responsible for beginning the American Red Cross. The eastern and western theaters of the war were divided by the Appalachian Mountains. Most action took place in the Eastern Theater as each army aimed to take the other nation's capital cities, Richmond and Washington, D.C. Kentucky and Missouri were important states to control in the Western Theater. President Lincoln seemed to understand this more so than Jefferson Davis. Lincoln is quoted as saying, "I'd love to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." The Union had early successes in the West as General George B. McClellan secured the 41 counties in the western part of Virginia which stayed loyal to the Union. These counties would become West Virginia and would be admitted as a state in 1863. General Ulysses S. Grant had a bold plan, knowing that the Southern supply line was stretched and undermanned in the West. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston's men were undertrained and ill-equipped. Grant wanted to gain control of key rivers to secure Kentucky and Tennessee. General Grant targeted Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River in February of 1862. Grant first went after Fort Henry. He devised a strategy in which the Navy's gunboats would start the firing and then the infantry would arrive. General Grant was able to take Fort Henry and would go on to take Fort Donelson. When Confederates asked for terms of surrender, Grant replied, no surrender was acceptable other than unconditional surrender. Grant was the Union's newest hero, and Northern newspapers began to refer to him as Unconditional Surrender Grant. The Battle of Shiloh, or Pittsburgh's Landing, took place April 6th and 7th in 1862 in the Western Theater. Ulysses Grant continued his drive into the South, reaching Shiloh in southern Tennessee, waiting along the banks of the Tennessee River for reinforcements. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston surprised the Union forces in a surprise attack. The Hornet's Nest was a Union defense line along a sunken road attacked by the Confederates. The Confederates suffered very high casualties, but did force the Union to fall back to Pittsburgh Landing. During this action, Johnston was mortally wounded and replaced by P.G.T. Beauregard. Thinking that victory was a sure thing, Beauregard held off continuing the attack to develop a strategy for the next day. However, Union reinforcements with General Don Carlos Buell strengthened Grant, who attacked the next day and was able to drive the Confederates out in retreat. Shiloh would be an important Union victory. Success in the Western Theater put pressure on the Union in the Eastern Theater. General George B. McClellan replaced General McDowell as he was put in command of the biggest Union army in the Eastern Theater. He developed a strategy to take Richmond from the southeast by sailing down the Potomac River into the Chesapeake Bay and up the James River towards Richmond. This became known as the Peninsular Campaign. Several battles were part of this campaign, including the Battle of Hampton Roads, in which the first two ironclad ships, the Monitor and the Merrimac, did battle. Navies would change from wooden ships to iron ships and then later to steel after seeing the Monitor and the Merrimac. McClellan was fighting against Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston. Johnston would be severely wounded in the Battle of Seven Pines and would be replaced by General Robert E. Lee. Lee was able to halt McClellan's advance. The 7 days battle took place at the end of the Peninsular Campaign. Robert E. Lee and Confederate President Jefferson Davis both knew that if McClellan launched an all-out offensive on Richmond, he'd be successful. However, McClellan was very cautious and would not launch such an attack. Also, Lee launched an attack himself. A series of battles would make up the 7 days battle. In the end, Lee stopped McClellan from capturing the Confederate capital. It was an important Confederate victory since Richmond was held by the Confederates. The Second Battle of Bull Run, or Second Manassas, was another important Confederate victory. Union General John Pope had won battles in the West and was given command of an army in the Eastern Theater. Pope looked to link up with George B. McClellan and attack Richmond. However, Lee sent Stonewall Jackson through the Thoroughfare Gap to Manassas, where Jackson attacked Pope. Pope needed reinforcements, but McClellan wasn't quick to send soldiers. In the evening, both sides made their plans, but the next day there was confusion. Confederate General James Longstreet came and reinforced Stonewall Jackson. Pope was forced to retreat back to Washington. Lincoln was most disappointed, and Pope resigned his commission. By now, the realities of war had sunk in, and any idea of this war being a short, quick, adventurous war was long gone. There was seeming to be no end in sight. The Battle of Antietam, or Battle of Sharpsburg, is often considered the first crucial point of the war. The Confederates had been on the defensive for the war, but at this point, General Robert E. Lee looked to take the war to the north on an invasion of Maryland. This was driven by the Confederates' need for supplies, as well as the several Confederate victories in the Eastern Theater. In addition, Lee believed that pro-Confederate forces in Maryland would rise up and help bring Maryland into the Confederacy. Lee's battle plans would be lost and fell into the hands of the Union. Lee had to change his plans. George B. McClellan, the Union commander, had an opportunity. However, he was slow to act when he could have destroyed Lee's army. McClellan also lost a chance to end the war when he didn't attack immediately when Lee had lost and Lee was able to slip away into Virginia. The Burnside Bridge is a landmark that remains from the battle, named after General Ambrose Burnside, who defended the bridge. The Sunken Road is often called Bloody Lane and was the scene of heavy fighting in the center of the lines. In 3 hours, 5,500 soldiers were killed or wounded. Dunkard Church was a scene of some of the fighting, and it became a focal point of the battle. It also became a medical aid station. The Battle of Antietam was the first crucial point of the war because the Union victory gave President Lincoln the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the Confederate States. This made the war a war against slavery. Doing this ensured that the nations of Europe would not recognize the South and establish aid or trade. The South continued to work for foreign recognition, but Antietam proved to be crucial because after the Emancipation Proclamation, Europe would stay neutral. France and Britain would not, in good faith, support a territory that enslaved a group of people. The world now knew that the Civil War was for a much higher cause: human freedom. The Civil War had been fought for about 2 years with terrible devastation. Northerners were beginning to lose faith that the Union government could not stop the rebellion. Lincoln, therefore, took action with the Emancipation Proclamation. This only freed the slaves in the South and would be a wartime measure. When Union troops moved through southern states, thousands of slaves left their masters and were free.
We've gotten the story of Abraham Lincoln quite right. He was a little bit better than the rest of us.
He's probably the smartest person ever to be president. And his learning curve is amazing.
He had his beliefs, and he stuck to his beliefs at a time when it wasn't popular to do so.
And at all of our crisis times, we've needed leaders who were just a little bit better. But Lincoln was really that good.
The essential thing to remember about Abraham Lincoln was that there was nothing in his background that predicted that he was going to be president of the United States. And in fact, if Lincoln had not been elected in 1860, almost no one ever would have heard of him. He was an accomplished lawyer, and he'd made a name for himself as an anti-slavery orator in the late 1850s. But even at his election, no one expected great things of Abraham Lincoln.
He was a man who became president at maybe the worst moment in our country's history.
At the beginning of the war and the beginning of his running, Lincoln did not advocate black equality.
Lincoln's principal objective was to save the Union, and then we'll deal with slavery. But before too long, he had to both save the Union and deal with slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation.
Here was a man who very reluctantly was sort of taking on the issue of slavery. He really did not want to. I mean, if you read any literature, he never really wanted to embrace the slavery issue. It wasn't his issue. And yet he sort of, over a couple of conversations with Frederick Douglass, and really over time, came around to embracing that issue.
By 1864 is the best commander on either side. He understands the entire strategy of the war on a continental basis. He understands how to use the Navy. His orders to Grant are impeccable. Lincoln is, in the truest sense, the commander-in-chief.
By the end, Lincoln had totally grown to where he said that not only should blacks not be slaves, they should be treated as equal citizens with full enfranchisement, right to vote, right to participate. So Abe Lincoln was a person and president in progress. And the Lincoln that was assassinated was not the Lincoln that was first inaugurated.
Even after his election and his inauguration, there were long moments when Americans could say, what have we gotten ourselves into? Why did we choose this guy? And does he have the ability to rise to the challenge? The mythology of Lincoln all occurs, well, after his election, after his inauguration, and in particular, after his assassination.
The tragedy of his assassination, which unfortunately, that's what I think has helped create the martyr that he became.
He becomes Father Abraham. He becomes, for the next 2 generations, he becomes the personification of the American belief in liberty.
You won't be able to get anybody to agree on who a great president is, except Abraham Lincoln. I don't think you'd find an American who wouldn't say that he wasn't the greatest president.
Today, Lincoln is seen as a marble figure, a martyr, a phenomenon. Lincoln was the father of a second American Revolution and the political legacy we live with today. One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Yet none of this was ever Lincoln's original intent. Number 16. Abraham Lincoln, Republican, 1861 to 1865, 52 years old, from Illinois.
Lincoln was a conservative in the sense that he wanted to preserve and restore the Union as it had existed before the secession of the southern states and the beginning of the war. But the very events of the war pushed him step by step to the left, toward a more radical position, which eventually became revolutionary.
Lincoln was not the great emancipator. He becomes the great emancipator, to some extent against his own intention. I think that Lincoln shows you what greatness is, really. It is the capacity to grow, to understand a situation, to change.
In Lincoln's lifetime, people either loved him or hated him. One thing they couldn't do was ignore him.
He was very magnetic. He drew people to him, young people especially. Young men who were active in politics thought of him as a god. He had a famous sense of humor. He had an amazing storehouse of anecdotes and jokes for every occasion. It would drive some people crazy, even as president. He would have a story ready that would illustrate a point.
Hidden behind the humor was a very complex man. Lincoln obsessed over matters and often suffered prolonged periods of sadness, frustration, and even despair. Campaign literature called him Honest Abe, banking on his compulsion for seeking the truth. His other nickname, the Rail Splitter, was more of a political marketing invention in the Jacksonian tradition, capitalizing on Lincoln's working-class roots to appeal to the common man. From childhood, Lincoln was driven to make something of his life, to climb up out of poverty. He worked hard and relied on his wits, as he had not been blessed with good looks.
In the South, they attacked him as a scoundrelly-looking wretch, the cross between a nutmeg dealer and a horse swapper, whatever that means.
Lincoln turned his appearance into a positive by disarming people with self-deprecating humor. Once, after being called two-faced, he said, "If I were two-faced, would I be wearing this one?" Lincoln's election had been a political disaster for the Southern slave power, but his initial intention was just to halt the expansion of slavery into the Western territories.
He said if I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do that. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others in bondage, I would do that too.
He never had anything but moral outrage about it. But he, like most anti-slavery men, felt that the way to kill it, the way to destroy the institution, was to contain it and let it suffocate from within.
Waiting for Lincoln on his first day in office was a letter from Major Robert Anderson, the commander of Fort Sumter, located on an island in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Anderson warned that without a shipment of provisions, he would have to surrender to the rebels. Lincoln had three options. He could order a surrender, an attack, or send provisions. He chose the latter.
So basically, Lincoln said to Jefferson Davis, if you let this food go in peacefully, it will be a symbolic manifestation of our sovereignty over this fort, the United States sovereignty. If you stop it, then the burden of responsibility for starting a war will be on your shoulders.
Before Lincoln's supply ships arrived, Confederate President Jefferson Davis ordered his men to attack the fort. The first shot was fired. On April 12, 1861, the Civil War had begun. The violence at Fort Sumter motivated 4 more states to join the Confederacy. 4 others remained on the fence. Fort Sumter was surrendered to the South, but Major Anderson saved the American flag that had flown above it and brought it to New York City.
They took that tattered, ripped flag. It was very much like the World Trade Center flag that was displayed all over New York in the fall of 2001. And the flag inspired people. It created flag mania, patriotic fever. In a way, without Sumter, Lincoln might not have stirred up the Union to a mood that was necessary to fight to restore the Union, to preserve it.
By an act of shrewd calculation, Lincoln had baited the South into striking the first blow of the Civil War. Yet neither he nor Jefferson Davis anticipated what was about to unfold. It would be the first and only American presidency completely defined by war. Possessing no military expertise and humbled at the prospect of making life and death decisions, Lincoln gave himself a crash course on military strategy.
Lincoln did what any intelligent person would do. He went to the Library of Congress and took out books on military strategy and military administration and taught himself.
Lincoln also became personally fascinated with the technology of modern warfare. Within a year, he was well versed in military tactics and strategy. Yet nothing prepared Lincoln for the problems he was to experience with his generals. In August of 1861, Lincoln was furious upon hearing that Major General John C. Fremont had issued an emancipation proclamation in the border state of Missouri, becoming the first to free slaves owned by Confederates. Fearing Fremont's action would incite slave owners in all of the border states to join the Confederacy, Lincoln nullified Fremont's action and relieved him of duty. In February 1862, Lincoln's war effort was suddenly rocked by personal tragedy. His 11-year-old son, Willie, died from typhoid fever.
I think Lincoln saw most of himself in Willie and just never quite escaped from the veil of very deep melancholy that enveloped him in 1862.
In an effort to properly mourn their son's death, the Lincolns decided to temporarily leave the White House and move to the Soldiers' Home, an asylum for wounded soldiers in Northwest Washington. Finding themselves at peace there among the soldiers, the Lincolns adopted the home as their summer residence, turning Lincoln into a commuter for 1/4 of his presidency. From then on, the war consumed Lincoln. He worked night and day, 7 days a week, 18 or more hours a day. He was so anxious to stay on top of the latest war news, he would sometimes stay late or even all night at the U.S. Telegraph Office. In April 1862, exactly a year after Fort Sumter, the Union Army won a major, critically important victory at the Battle of Shiloh. But it came at a horrendous cost. Nearly 24,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing after the battle. Carnage triggered a turning point when Lincoln and others realized they were going to have to wage a total war. He privately recognized the need to refocus the purpose of the war from merely preserving the Union to addressing the greater moral issue of slavery. In July of 1862, Lincoln confided to his cabinet that he was prepared to surpass the legal powers of the presidency and exploit his unique wartime power as commander-in-chief. He announced his intention to abolish slavery in the rebellious states, not only to undermine the Confederacy's economic strength, but to end slavery in America forever. On September 22, 1862, Abraham Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation to the public.
This war, which began as a conservative effort to restore the status quo antebellum, evolved into a revolutionary war to destroy the old South and its social and economic system.
That's the transformative moment in American history. That's the second Declaration of Independence. That's the moment when Lincoln reaches the level of the Founding Fathers, where he fulfills the promise of the Declaration that had been so long denied to so many millions of individuals who had been denied freedom.
The problem was that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't win battles. Throughout 1862 and 1863, the Union enjoyed success in the West, but that was overshadowed by devastating losses in the East. By June 1863, the military situation in Virginia was getting desperate. Robert E. Lee's rebel army was on a winning streak and marching towards Pennsylvania. It came to a climax in the first days of July near the small farm town of Gettysburg.
The battle was supposed to be the mother of all battles. It was supposed to end the Civil War.
3 horrifying days of massacre ensued. The battleground was soaked in blood. Photographers produced morbid images of the carnage, exposing the nation to the horror of war. These were America's sons, brothers, husbands, lying dead on the battlefield. Lincoln himself sank into despair, overcome by the terrible loss. In November, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to help commemorate the battlefield as a national military cemetery.
Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes, and what he managed to do in this elegiac masterpiece is redefine the commitment of America to the Declaration of Independence, to the principles that all men are created equal, to laud the sacrifice of people who had given their lives that the nation might live. He believed that America was fighting not just for the promise of today, but what he called a vast future also, that all should have an equal chance and an unfettered start in the race of life, as he put it.
As inspiring as Lincoln's Gettysburg Address had been, Americans were weary of the bloodshed. By 1864, most wanted to see an end to the war. That That year, Lincoln ran for re-election against one of his former generals, George B. McClellan, who ran on a platform that promised to negotiate an end to the war if he were elected. It would be a contentious election that would test the resolve of a nation and its president. In the fall of 1864, Abraham Lincoln was running for his political life against General George B. McClellan. It was a time when Americans could have ended the war by casting their ballots for McClellan, who'd campaigned on a platform that implied he would negotiate an end to the war and, possibly, repeal the Emancipation Proclamation.
But Lincoln is not willing to take those steps that some people say would guarantee his re-election. Rescinding the Emancipation Proclamation, agreeing to an armistice with the South, agreeing to recognize the Southern Confederacy.
When he did refuse to back away, it looked like it would be at the cost of his re-election, because it looked like he would be defeated.
Looking back, it seems inevitable Lincoln's going to win. But it certainly didn't appear that way in 1864.
2 months before the election, the tide turned for Lincoln. General William Tecumseh Sherman had burned Atlanta and would, 10 weeks later, begin his infamous March to the Sea. Suddenly, the Union Army had momentum, and so did Lincoln.
Even though America was engaged in a terrible, bloody war, so many casualties, just unimaginable bloodshed and devastation, he still won 56% of the vote in the loyal states in 1864. That in itself is an extraordinary testament to people's faith in Lincoln.
It was a bittersweet victory. The misery of the war had taken its toll on Lincoln, emotionally and physically.
It's hard to find an American president who aged more than Abraham Lincoln did in 3.5 years. I think what you see in his face is knowing that he bore some of the responsibility for this whole disaster.
"4 years to the day after Lincoln first took the oath of office, he was taking it again on March 4th, 1865. This time around, Lincoln was a changed man. His visits to the front lines, his experience of living among the wounded at the soldiers' home, and his periodic commute between there and the White House brought him face to face with average Americans and contraband slaves. It had all deeply affected Lincoln, making him empathetic to the humanity of all men. Speaking at his second inaugural, he signaled his growth as a politician and compassion as a man. In what may be the most moving speech ever written by a president, he laid out his roadmap for peace and reconstruction of the nation, pledging malice toward none and charity for all.
He's talking about democracy. He's talking about liberty. He's talking about the necessity of coming to terms with the legacy of slavery for American history.
On April 9th, 1865, just weeks after Lincoln's inauguration, Robert E. Lee surrendered his Confederate Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant. The war was nearly over. Soon after, in what would be his last speech, Lincoln showed no signs of vindictiveness. Echoing the same themes from his inaugural address, he called upon the nation to heal itself. He spoke about giving favorable terms to the South, and for the first time in public, about granting the black man the right to vote. A couple of evenings later, on April 14th, Good Friday, the Lincolns attended Ford's Theater to see the comedy Our American Cousin. It was Lincoln's last night on Earth. Abraham Lincoln had grown up revering the Founding Fathers and the American democratic experiment. It was because of this first revolution that Lincoln was able to enjoy political freedom and equal opportunity. But by trying to save the republic the Founding Fathers had created, Lincoln transformed it and himself.
Lincoln faced the greatest crisis the country had ever seen, and he rises to the occasion. But in rising to the occasion, he changes his views.
Lincoln came to see that everyone, no matter what their race, creed, or religion, had a right to live the American dream.